Welcome to Echoes, a sumo history podcast. I'm Nathan with Honu Sumo Club in San Diego. And we're joined here today, and then we'll let JJ be kind of the other bread in the sandwich, by Brian Niiya with Densho. And Brian, could you explain a little bit about what you do and what Densho is?
Sure. Yeah, I'm the content director at Densho. Densho is basically an online resource that focuses on the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. So started out with an archive of interviews, oral histories we've done with those who lived through that experience that started, we started doing the interviews in the 1990s. And it's kind of evolved to include, digitized photographs and records, an online encyclopedia, which I edit, various visualization maps and different ways to visualize the data, all kinds of stuff. So it's become, I think, one of the best online resources for those who are interested in studying that topic.
Hello, and thank you for watching Echoes, a sumo history podcast. This is a passion project of ours, and without the fine people, the staff, and everybody involved at Densho, we would not be able to do this project. Especially when you're doing anything in history, it's really important to focus in on the people that are recording the history and trying to preserve it. Densho is an amazing organization trying to capture history of Japanese people when they were unjustly incarcerated during World War II and after. They focus in on two-dimensional media, which is exactly what we're doing. Please donate to Densho. It's densho.org. I'll go ahead and put it right here. Please go ahead and donate to them. That would make everyone here at Maximum Effort Studios extremely happy. And ultimately, it'll help preserve the past so that we do not repeat it.
And JJ, do you want to do a little more introduction on yourself or no?
No, I'm all right. I'm JJ. You guys know me, or you don't. It's okay.
All right. That's true. Our audience does. That's true. Other people who matter might not, but our audience does. It's true. Brian, I think some of the things, as we go through this, if there's anything you think of that we should kind of add and come back to later, that's fine at the end of the interview. That'd be great. And feel free to chime in if there's something else, other context, or maybe if we're asking the wrong questions. So that's fine. A lot of us, and JJ and I kind of know the history of kind of World War II incarceration, and we know it didn't start on December 7th. But I think, as we talk, I want to kind of start there, just start abruptly on December 7th. And then as we kind of go through, maybe if there's context that needs to be laid from kind of what came before and why things happened, we can do that. December 7th, Japan, Imperial Japan has its surprise attack. What started happening right away in the US, both kind of, first within the Japanese American community, kind of around the West Coast generally?
Yeah, so right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, within hours.
Hours.
The local law enforcement and the FBI started basically rounding up Japanese immigrant community leaders in the continental U.S. and in Hawaii. Important to note that at that point in time, there were more people of Japanese descent in Hawaii than in the entire continental U.S. Japanese migration really started in Hawaii, which was a territory of the U.S., not a state at the time.
Right.
And they were able to do this because various branches of governmental law enforcement, primarily the Office of Naval Intelligence and the FBI, had been monitoring, surveilling the Japanese American community for almost a decade prior to the attack, anticipating that war was possible. So they had all these lists already prepared of people that they were going to pick up in the event of war. One of them was my grandfather, who was a newspaper editor of one of the main Japanese newspapers in Honolulu.
Which one?
The Nippujiji.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. They
later became.
I've been looking at them. Yeah. Okay.
So he was, my mom remembers, the always two large men in suits who come to the door, at 11 o'clock that night and, ask for my grandfather, and, he goes off and they don't see him again for months.
Okay.
This happens up and down the West Coast and in Hawaii. And it's largely people who are leaders of the community, people who are associated or lead kind of Japanese American organizations, economic organizations, religious organizations, cultural organizations, in particular Buddhist priests, because Buddhism and Shinto were seen as kind of alien religions.
Right.
There were a handful of Japanese Christian pastors picked up also, but a much smaller number.
Okay.
Japanese language school principals and instructors, people like my grandfather, who was a journalist, a newspaper editor. So several hundred are picked up right away, a couple thousand within, hours. And these roundups continue for the next few months. They're put in local detention, often kind of local jails and prisons initially, and then taken to internment camps run by the INS, the Justice Department, in different parts of the country.
Okay, so was that because all of these were Issei leaders? And for our audience, could you explain a little bit about kind of the generational terminology?
Sure. Yeah. So Japanese migration to the U.S. and Hawaii starts in the late 1800s, really peaks around the turn of the century. And it's a long story, but there's a substantial anti-Japanese sentiment that leads to immigration laws that ban further Japanese migration in 1924. So pretty much these Issei, these would be Japanese immigrants have been in the U.S. for 20, 30, 40, 50 years by the time the war comes along. And the reason that the generational terms come into play is that once the American-born generation comes along, and the Nisei generation, this is the American-born generation, because of the way the immigration restrictions work, they're mostly born between like 1915 and 1930, 35, maybe a little earlier in Hawaii. They really are a generation in a kind of genealogical sense.
So it's not just kind of like a general age court. It is these like odd kind of wave kind of, or spikes in kind of birth and ages. Okay.
Yeah, and then the key thing is that Japanese immigrants and all Asian immigrants are prohibited from becoming naturalized United States citizens before World War II, which is a huge impact on their lives. A lot of the discriminatory legislation is built around this idea of being aliens ineligible to citizenship, was the term.
Right, like the alien land law in California.
And so forth.
Yeah.
But the Nisei, as being American-born, had birthright American citizenship. So it was important to kind of distinguish between that group and the immigrant group because of the citizenship issue. And of course, as an Nisei, they're born and raised in the US, go to American schools, live in many cases typical American childhoods, and listen to the same radio programs and the same media as everyone else. So they grew up very much, in this very American realm. So there's this very large kind of cultural distinctions between the two groups as well. And then, of course, one group speaks primarily English, one group speaks primarily Japanese. So there's very clear distinctions. So I think the combination of these clear distinctions, and just the fact that the Nisei really are this generational cohort who are all similar in age and have similar experiences, really, I think, solidifies those terms. And I think the war does as well, because I think because of what happens to Japanese Americans during World War II, I think for almost all Nisei, the war is this huge turning point in their lives, one way or the other.
Yeah, because most Nisei then are born kind of between like 1910 and 1930-ish.
Yeah. Right around the time of the war, the median age of the Nisei is they're like high school age, 17, 18.
Okay, all right. Okay, so actually a little younger than I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, I mean, there are some who are older and young adults and established, and some who are little children. But there's a the largest number of Nisei. I actually kind of check this out in the statistics, were born in 1921, 22, 23, early 20s was the largest group in Nisei, which would have made them, college age, and as it turns out, prime age for military service.
Right.
When war came along.
Right. Okay. So why was the initial suspicion kind of directed at those community leaders? Like you mentioned a little bit about like Buddhism and its association with Shintoism, but why generally was that group kind of targeted and for arrest, like not just kind of like additional surveillance, but arrest within hours?
Yeah, well, I think the government just had this idea that it kind of equated Japanese culture with Japanese kind of sympathy with Japanese politics. Never mind that many of the Japanese immigrants actually came here to avoid being conscripted into the Japanese army during the Russo-Japanese War.
Right. I know. I was kind of wondering about that.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't a planned part of this interview, but I kind of noticed like, that's an interesting like 1905 spike. Offloading in Seattle and San Francisco.
A disproportionate number of the immigrants were Christian.
Right.
Which in Meiji Japan becomes kind of again associated with the West, and therefore
foreignness.
Christians I think were persecuted in in the 1800s. So anyway, I'm probably losing the main thread here. But the U.S. government just was suspicious of this group that looked different, practiced largely a different religion. I mean, there were a lot of Christians, but it was still primarily Buddhist. Different religion, different language, and I think there's just this immigrants who look different. Didn't come from Europe, were just viewed differently, and Japanese and Chinese before them were viewed as unassimilable. The idea that no matter how many generations they were in the US, they could never blend in and become Americans in the same way that immigrants from, say, Germany or Italy by the second generation could, shed all vestiges of their foreignness and become just American.
Right.
I think for the groups that just look physically different, it just was, it was different. It was
As a person who grew up in Japan as a child, I can relate.
Yeah.
So
the irony is that Japanese Americans in Japan, as well as Americans in general, were viewed in very much the same way. As being of questionable loyalty and unassimilable and received pretty harsh treatment. Anyway, so I think
why was that? I'm sorry. Why was that?
Why
were they viewed in that way? Like even Japanese Americans in Japan.
Well, Japanese American. This is a long.
So it does actually connect though to several of the people we're gonna talk about.
That's
so it's
true.
Totally relevant.
That's true.
It's totally
you're
relevant.
right. Yeah, a disproportionate number, I think, of the Sumo community probably were in this group. So there were substantial numbers of Nisei. These are American-born Japanese Americans who end up in Japan, either in the 20s and 30s, where they're sent as children to be educated in Japan. I think what it is their parents. Well, one, there were economic reasons for that both parents had to work, and it was easier to send the kids to be raised by grandpa and grandma back in Japan. Not that different from today in a lot of ways. But also there was a political calculation in many cases where, because of the racism that Japanese immigrants faced in the US, they were hedging their bets. So it's like, I don't know if Junior's future is going to be in the US. So let's send him to Japan. He can learn Japanese and Japanese culture, and maybe his life chances might be better there going forward. And then in the 1930s, as the Japanese Empire comes into play and Japan becomes this imperial power and invades and colonizes different parts of Asia, they're actively seeking people to come to the frontiers of Asia, from their perspective. And many Nisei are drawn to that. Many of the kind of smartest, most accomplished Nisei in the 1930s, graduates of UCLA and graduates of Ivy League schools, no one will hire them. They can just
Yeah.
the only jobs they can get are with their parents, vegetable market or produce markets. And so a lot of them go to Japan for college or because they can get jobs there commensurate with their education. And they go to Manchuria, they go to other parts of the empire. So you have a substantial population of Nisei in Japan, and from the Japanese perspective, they're viewed suspiciously, especially as tensions build between the U.S. and Japan. War breaks out, these Nisei who are in Japan are viewed by the Japanese as are they really loyal? Are they loyal Japanese, or are they somehow more American? They're of suspect loyalty. They're culturally a little different because they were raised in the U.S. Their Japanese isn't as good, so they're viewed, ironically, very similarly to how Japanese Americans are viewed in the U.S. from the U.S. perspective, which is also questioning their loyalty and their Americanness and so forth.
Yeah. So this is actually slightly off topic, but I'm sure there was some sort of detention and roundup of, say, Caucasian Americans living in Japan or similar. But was there any kind of like detention or roundup of like the term is kibe, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well,
okay.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, yeah. Although I think there are different gradations of that. But the answer is that white Americans were rounded up. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't know this. But yeah, basically, Japanese Americans were not systematically rounded up. And just many were. They had a very difficult time, but many found niches because of their language abilities. Working in media. Famously, Iva Toguri and others worked for radio stations where they broadcast messages in English. Some worked as translators. So there were occupational niches for them. But yeah, they had often a very, very difficult time because of they in many of the same ways that Japanese Americans in the U.S. did, because they were just not viewed as trustworthy. Okay.
Why would like kind of sports or martial arts leaders kind of be included in this kind of roundup? Back to the American side.
Yes.
But why would they be included in that kind of roundup?
Well, I think that again, just the equating of expressions of Japanese culture with Japanese political sympathies. I think that was just I think that was a simplistic way of looking at things. I think in the case of kendo, there probably were some political ties to more of a pro-Japan sentiment. I think maybe less so in sumo. This is where someone like Professor Azuma would be the expert on this. But yeah, I think a lot of it was just this idea of Japanese cultural expression, not just sumo and sports, but also flower arranging and language and
that dangerous ikebana,
Japanese dance and so on. All of these are somehow suspect, because somehow that expression of culture must mean there's some sort of political sympathy as well.
One of the things I've noticed that's interesting is there did seem to be a little bit of a difference in kind of in like Southern California sumo. There was a connection to the Japanese Sumo Association, and there were relationships. And when Japanese like training ships would come through, like Port of Los Angeles, there would be these like welcoming ceremonies and a picnic, and often there'd be a sumo tournament as part of that. And so local Nisei wrestlers would wrestle these like naval cadets on these like training ships. So that was a thing that happened. But Northern California, that would happen a bit in San Francisco too. But also it does seem like kind of the Sacramento, especially kind of like sumo association, was a bit more, I don't know, like imperialist sympathetic.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
More nationalistic. Yeah.
But
my sense is that I mean, what plays out in the camps and the incarceration is that a lot of the more nationalistic elements, and there are a lot of factors behind this, were more rural and kind of Central California areas, which was also the hotbed of sumo, right? That was kind of the, there were several centers of sumo, but that kind of Fresno to Sacramento was definitely a major area. Right.
So once people were getting detained, what, that kind of does lead, nice segue into what sort of like screening criteria were there? Issei are being detained, and then what started happening? Like, how did the FBI start sorting through them?
Right. Yeah. So a lot of the sorting had happened before. So the FBI had already has these lists developed. So they arrest. They start arresting these community leaders. And interesting thing is, J. Edgar Hoover, right, the head of the FBI, who's not exactly known as a civil libertarian, felt that they had done their job. They had surveilled the community. They had arrested the people that they felt were dangerous, and they had interned them. There was actually a process where they received hearings. And the hearings were sort of kangaroo courts, but they did receive hearings, and the hearings had real outcomes where some of them were actually released to return to their families, or in many cases to return to their families in another set of camps that had been set up.
Right. At the point they were cleared. And we'll get to the assembly centers and everything too.
And then others were determined to be too dangerous and thus were to be interned for the duration of the war. My grandfather was one of those. He was not going to be released, so he was he was ruled to be detained for the remainder of the war. So the FBI felt that they had done their job. They had arrested these few thousand people, but for various reasons, there was political gain to be made on the West Coast by kind of vilifying, the remaining Japanese Americans. Agricultural organizations, farm organizations, other business organizations who saw them as competitors continued to agitate for their complete removal. And basically one thing led to another. And eventually, in February of 1942, President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which basically allows the Army to designate zones from which they don't say Japanese Americans in the executive order, but Japanese Americans could be excluded from, and that set the stage for this mass removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. So that starts. The executive order is in February. The systematic removal starts in March and April and continues through the summer of 1942. So, 110,000 people living in basically all of California, kind of the western halves of Oregon and Washington are removed and sent to these detention camps largely in the western remote areas of the western states.
It was interesting. Yeah, I was kind of curious about how that investigative process worked, and I kind of assumed maybe it happened like after people had been arrested. So it's interesting that it was kind of the surveillance and kind of sorting work had happened in advance. Which is interesting.
Do we have a time frame on how far in advance the surveillance started?
It was almost a decade. It starts in the early 30s and really kind of builds into the late 30s, because Japan is getting increasingly imperialistic in the 30s and tensions rise. So leaders kind of knew that war was a distinct possibility. So it really ramps up in the late 1930s.
So like in 1931, when Japan invades Manchuria and creates the kind of puppet Manchukuo government, and then in 1937, after Marco Polo Bridge, kind of after that intensification. Sorry, I'm a nerd.
Yes. Impressed all of that. But yeah, and interesting thing. Again, this may be too much of an aside, but one of the main investigators is a man named Kenneth Ringel, who would work for the Office of Naval Intelligence.
Okay.
And interestingly, he came away from it largely feeling that, aside from these small number of people that they identified, that that there wasn't really any threat from Japanese Americans, and filed a report to that effect. And there was also another report commissioned by by Roosevelt's administration, the Munson Report, that again investigated the Japanese community and largely concluded that there really wasn't a danger. But for various reasons, the Roosevelt administration ignored those recommendations. There was actually a real tension within the Roosevelt administration. His Justice Department really opposed any further actions against Japanese Americans, but the War Department and the Army really favored, further action. This mass race-based exclusion and removal. The Justice Department really feared that this was unconstitutional and unnecessary. But the Justice Department lost, and the War Department and Army won, and
so
basically policy was implemented.
Okay, so each kind of whatever military command was given a kind of almost carte blanche to regulate their area.
Right.
And then in the Pacific Coast states, that became a wholesale thing, as opposed to Hawaii that played out a bit differently, right?
The Hawaii story is fascinating, and it, to me, is like, it really illustrates really clearly how unnecessary the policy was, because Hawaii, which was actually attacked and which is 2,500 miles closer to the front, didn't feel the need for a mass removal or incarceration of Japanese Americans. They interned, 1% of the Japanese American population. The rest were allowed to go on with their lives, and many made great contributions to the war effort.
So I'm curious, do you think that kind of the thing that then resulted in the mass removal in the spring of 1942. Was that kind of like a gradual slow burn? Was it kind of like, was there kind of some big precipitating decision, or was it as boring as there was just a committee meeting and somebody won the committee meeting?
Yeah, I think it was more that,
Okay.
I don't think there was any major precipitating event aside of Pearl Harbor, of course.
Right.
But there were a bunch of little things that happened, little in the grand scheme of things, that eventually led to this policy. Over the years, scholars have ascribed different levels of blame to different players in the drama, from the press and politicians and pressure groups in California, to specific individuals in the Army or the Justice Department, or to FDR himself, who ultimately is signing the executive order. It's a complicated story, but there are a lot of figures who played a role in this decision coming to pass. Earl Warren, the Attorney General and later Governor of California, was one of the main proponents of this policy, and of course, ironically, becomes the civil rights icon as a Supreme Court justice.
That is a whole, because interestingly
later.
That's something how that happened, I'm really interested in. That is way an aside, but it is really interesting.
But the thing that's fascinating is just how universal sentiment against Japanese Americans was at that time. I mean, you can literally name the politicians on the West Coast who opposed this policy on the fingers of one hand. I mean, it was universal, and it was all segments of society. So it was kind of remarkable. I mean, it's hard to get politicians to agree on anything, that the sky is blue, but there was just this universal agreement, at that time that we should do this thing.
Yeah. Because I was noticing, I was reading Dr. Eiichiro Azuma's book, Between Two Empires, about that kind of interwar period and and how Japanese American communities in the mainland U.S. really kind of formed identity in opposition to, or where they fit. But what thing that was interesting is it was everything from labor unions to agribusiness to, like, as far as like all the directions and interest groups that the Japanese American community was kind of caught between. And the catch-22s, so many catch-22s that really culminate in World War II and the removal. So one other thing I'm kind of curious about was, I noticed there were also several kind of spurts of roundups between that initial December 7th roundup and then the mass removals later in the spring. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about those kind of like in between roundups?
Not a ton. I'm not. Okay. I don't know the reasons for that, but they're after the big roundup right after Pearl Harbor in January or in December. There was another big one in February. Up and down the coast, and I'm not sure what the rationale for that specifically was. Mm-hmm. But I definitely noticed that in February.
That one I noticed. Yeah, so I feel weird because I've been just teaching about this thing called the inference ladder, and don't like jump way to conclusions, like withhold judgment. But I definitely get a sense of, the executive order and mass removal is going to happen. Let's round up the next wave of people who make trouble about this. It almost seems preparatory. Just the timing is right. I might just be, it's a pretty big conspiracy, so I guess it's not that crazy conspiracy theory to make that happen. So I'm not prone to them generally, but okay. And then, so how did the mass removal process, how did that kind of roll out? How was it announced and organized?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that this idea, we have this image now of Japanese Americans being taken to these, concentration camps, throughout. But that wasn't the government's intent or policy, right? The idea, the thought initially was that we're going to designate these areas and encourage Japanese Americans to move themselves out of these areas by this certain date. In starting in March of 42, there was something called voluntary evacuation, where Japanese Americans were encouraged to move on their own. And it just totally failed because, people who lived in Arizona or, New Mexico or wherever rightfully asked, well, if these people are too dangerous to be in California, why should we allow them to move here? The government had vilified Japanese Americans so much that there was, extreme resistance by leaders in these other states. And then Japanese Americans, like 90% of them lived on the West Coast. So they didn't necessarily have friends or relatives who lived in other parts of the country, right? So that ability to move, the logistics of moving was just very difficult. So that policy just didn't work. Out of the 110,000 Japanese Americans in the restricted area, like 5,000 managed to actually move out of the state. Another 5,000 moved to areas just over, like California, all the states, there was basically a line drawn through the middle of the state. So like
the Sierras and Cascades.
Washington was restricted, the eastern half was okay. So another 5,000 moved to the other side of the line. And then, of course, what happens is that in California, in June of 42, the government changes their mind. They say, you know what, we're going to exclude all of California. So these people these 5,000 people who moved across the line, they ended up getting sent to camps anyway. So what happens is that after this failure of this policy of voluntary evacuation, the government decides, crap, how are we gonna do this? So they start building these temporary detention centers later that were called assembly centers was the term they used. But they quickly built existing facilities near where Japanese Americans lived. The most famous being the Santa Anita and Tanforan racetracks in Los Angeles and San Francisco, but also fairgrounds up and down the coast, a livestock pavilion in Portland, and so on.
The
So there are
fairgrounds in
existing
Washington, where I
facilities.
used to live.
Yeah, that they could just quickly use existing facilities, throw up some barracks as a short-term place to stash people, and then at the same time building these longer-term, from the ground up detention centers in remote parts of the countries. These are the Heart Mountains, Wyomings, and the Topaz Utahs, and so forth. So there's 10 of those camps that are being built. So this policy, the more I study it, the more you realize how flying by the seat of the pants the government was doing. That these camps were largely unfinished when Japanese Americans arrived, and many times they had to kind of finish building the camps themselves. It was just very chaotic and kind of ill-planned. And people really suffered in those early months because of that.
That's something that when JJ, Christina, and I in the spring we visited, we went on the Manzanar pilgrimage to Manzanar, and that was something that I'd visited Manzanar before, and I'd studied a little bit about removal and incarceration, but I didn't know about that part. Like, you're building your own camp.
Right.
Okay.
Manzanar in particular. Manzanar was sort of it was built first as a reception center, was the term.
Okay.
And so it was meant to be this place where the people who couldn't find a way to Utah or wherever, they could go here for a few weeks, and then from there they could move on. That was the idea. But again, resistance from these other states saying, no, we're not accepting any Japanese here. Famously, Herbert Maw, the governor of Wyoming, said, the only Japanese, except you didn't use that word, who are sent here they're going to be hanging from trees. So there was a lot of resistance from neighboring states, and so Manzanar goes from being this reception center, this way station, to being a detention center with barbed wire fences and guard towers and so forth. That wasn't the original intent. That's just the policy that evolved.
So I'm curious, because you talked about this during this phase of voluntary evacuation. People couldn't kind of uncouple and move their whole lives, but then all of a sudden they're forced to.
Yes.
Like, what did they do with their property, their belongings? I mean, and for our narrow, kind of parochial interest, there are things like sumo trophies, their keshomawashi, their belts, their gumbai, their fans. Like, what happened to things like that?
A lot of that stuff got lost. It's when I was working on an exhibit, and keshomawashi, I love them. They're like these amazing
beautiful
artifacts, but there's not many of them around. A lot of them got lost at that time period. People, it was all very chaotic. People were giving very little notice to get rid of their homes and their businesses, their farms. Farmers were prohibited from abandoning their farms because they were growing food.
I saw that.
So they had
it was like sabotage.
Right. They had to continue to tend to their crops, even though they would not be able to profit from them. And then they had to find buyers for their possessions. Famously, you had people coming in and offering pennies on the dollar for them, saying, "Hey, I'll give you $2 for that refrigerator. You better sell it to me, because if you don't sell it to me, you're going to get nothing." Some Japanese Americans sold under those conditions. Some just said, "Screw that. I'm just going to give it away," or I refuse to sell it to you under those conditions. Others were able. There were some who were able to. They had friends or relatives or not relatives, I guess, but friends who could hold their possessions for them. The government actually had provisions, storage facilities set up so that Japanese Americans could store their things, but famously many of those were vandalized later. They were not properly protected. So there was tremendous losses. Again, there were exceptions. There were cases like the farming communities in Central California, Cortez, Livingston, were able to actually quickly put together a company that would oversee and manage the farms that were absent. Right. There were particular individuals who took it upon themselves to care for the properties of their Japanese American friends. So there are a lot of individual stories like that, but as a group, there were just tremendous losses. Even people who were able to keep their farms and properties, a lot of them lost them later because they were in camp. They were unable to pay property taxes or keep up with mortgages. And to make life even more difficult, the state of California also decided to ramp up enforcement of alien land laws while Japanese Americans were away, right? They couldn't defend themselves readily. So they actually launched alien land law proceedings, ramped that up, and actually legislature allotted more money to prosecute alien land law cases while the Japanese Americans were.
Okay, and so then those were handled in absentia without real due process.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is jumping way ahead in the story, but I think if I don't ask it now, I'll forget about it because squirrels, and I'll chase them. But you mentioned like the vandalism, but what if like those locations or that storage, like what would have happened if somebody had, let's say, been like repatriated to Japan after the war? For people who either decided repatriation or they decided to revoke their U.S. citizenship, and if they had dual citizenship, like those people, what happened to their property as far as like personal property? I imagine their land, is a different thing.
Right. I'm not even sure about that.
Okay.
I mean, I think there were. I think some, like I said, some were able to hold on to their property and have it shipped, and some lost it. But I don't know as a rule what the percentages of that, how that worked out exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I remember in college, I did my bachelor's thesis interviewing several people who their family, they were in like college. That was kind of the theme. People in college at the point of when removal happened, and they were on West Coast colleges. And then did they move, transfer to colleges? Did they go to their families with a camp and then later put a parole to go to a school? Things like that. So it was that was the topic. But I remember talking to a woman whose family lived down in Watts, and they were truck farmers who take their food up to, Little Tokyo in LA or something and sell it. And they buried their property in the backyard. And then the family never went back to it. It's buried in the backyard somewhere in Watts. There
are a lot of stories like that. Where lots of stuff buried in yards that maybe someone will dig up someday and wonder what that is.
Oh, I want to dig up that cassette tape and find a cassette tape player and listen to it and find out, try to track it down. That's a weird American archaeology fantasy project I have. But so the other thing, this is just, for me, as you were talking about a lot of these things that were lost, the object that kind of comes to my mind is in the late 20s in Sacramento, there was a man who his wrestling name was Toshuzan, and he was the Yokozuna of Northern California, and he had a kesho mawashi, and there's a picture of him in this kesho mawashi as the California Yokozuna, and then 10 years later, but he died in 1929, fairly young, as a young man, and in 1938 there's a picture of the top wrestlers in Northern California, and that same kesho mawashi is being worn by somebody else, right? This was something being handed down within, the Northern California sumo community, as a legacy kesho mawashi. And I mean, I would love to find it. I would love to find it. But it's probably gone, and that's something that's really. So JJ's pulling up our little document of my crazy amounts of research I've been doing, and this tiger on the kesho mawashi, and so
there, as you might expect, there are more of them in Hawaii that survived. Right. Because again, there was no mass removal there, so.
And just so you know, we do. We found enough to kind of chew on with just kind of California right now. But we've also found enough, and looking at Nippujiji and all that's available in Nippujiji, I think we could do a whole additional series of half a dozen episodes on Hawaii pre-war the earlier revival in Hawaii.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's
right.
I think that could totally happen.
Yeah, and then the former governor of Hawaii, George Ariyoshi, his father was a well-known sumo wrestler in Hawaii, which I think is a fascinating story.
Yeah, and he's still living. And Japanese American National Museum has a picture that I have not physically seen yet of Governor Ariyoshi being held up as a tiny baby wearing a baby keshomawashi.
Yes.
And I want to see that picture.
Right.
But I haven't been able to yet.
Yeah.
But they have the copy negative there that I want to go see. So yeah, that would be interesting. And I would love to score that interview if he's able. That would be awesome too. With him.
He's got to be close to 100 years old.
Yes, he is. Yeah. He's over 100 now. Also, weird squirrel moment. I have a piece of furniture that didn't belong to him, but another governor of Hawaii that's like made out of koa wood that's in my other room that my dad bought at a silent auction in Hawaii when he lived there. Anyway, school fundraiser. So treasured item. So
what about the activities in the camps?
Yeah.
So, these camps were run by a newly formed federal agency called the War Relocation Authority, and they had this kind of contradictory policy that on the one hand they wanted to run the camps like as if they were small towns. So they established schools and they established newspapers and recreational programs, baseball leagues and football and all these sports. But they also emphasize. I mean, part of the thinking at the time was part of the reasons Japanese Americans had become so vilified is because they were clannish. They stuck together. They didn't blend in. And so there was an overt effort to teach and emphasize kind of American culture and play down Japanese culture. So, but then that sort of contradicted with the WRA's also policy of also feeling like we don't want Indian reservations, right? This is bad for Japanese Americans. We want to get loyal Japanese Americans out of the camps as soon as possible to other parts, because they're just excluded from the West Coast. If we can get them out, get them past security clearances, they can resettle in Chicago and New York and Denver, and so they're doing these two different things that are a little contradictory at the same time. And so, there are these extensive recreational programs that are started, but they're really emphasizing the American sports, and to different degrees they allow sumo and other Japanese sports.
I noticed that there was sumo, there was judo. I kind of went down a little rabbit hole. This was my little space where I found the Manzanar newspaper, and I basically read every article that I could find in the Library of Congress, which took me down a lot of old-timey kind of like newspaper rhetoric, and then just seeing how it's like baseball gets like a very big spot in the sport, and then sumo will kind of disappear. It would show up depending on like somebody's acting up in the camp, so they took that away for like a few months, then bring it back. It's this weird flex of seeing like what they would take away and what they wouldn't. And one of the things they never took away was baseball. I noticed that baseball was always there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we can say that baseball and other kind of American sports were encouraged, and I think sumo and Japanese sports were tolerated, because they knew that it had value in terms of pleasing Issei and Kibe in particular, and it was a way to keep peace in the camps and keep people out of trouble. But it was, like I said, it was tolerated, and as opposed to the way baseball in particular was treated, where there are dozens of baseball teams, whereas sumo, it varies it varies from camp to camp. There was a lot more in some places than others. Some of it having to do with administration, some of it having to do with just who the camp population was in different camps. So
it seemed like that space was also shared with local weightlifters.
Yes.
So
yes.
the dojo would be a multi-purpose area, which I also found very interesting.
Yeah. The weightlifters in particular camps, Tule Lake, I know in particular, had extensive weightlifting club, and a couple future Olympic weightlifters were there. So there was definitely a strong, strength training subculture in many of the camps as well. A third of the population were youngsters, so it was there was just a lot of need for recreational activity for these teenagers and young adults.
So do you think there was a point at which, you talked about kind of camp variability, do you think some things or some camps were really driven by camp administration, and which things do you think kind of came from the incarcerees themselves? Was it, where was the demand coming from, or was it a mix?
I think it's a mix, but I think, I think a lot of what happens in the camps is driven by who was there, who the population was. Basically the WRA, what wasn't the WRA? I guess it was more the army, dictated that basically people from specific areas generally went to the same camp. So all the LA, LA is an exception because LA is so big, but all the Bay Area people basically go to Topaz. So it's largely an urban population, not a lot of farmers. So
to Utah.
For their art school and their music school, and all the Pacific Northwest people, the Seattle people, I should say, go to Minidoka, Idaho, Seattle and Portland. So it's also very urban. Pacific Northwest. The Arizona camps are more rural, like the people from the southern part of California, Orange County, San Diego,
south
Valley,
of Encinitas,
end up in Poston. So the camps have a distinct kind of flavor that reflects, the population. So the Central California folks, Fresno and Stockton people ended up in the Arkansas camps. A lot of the other Central California people end up in Tule Lake, Sacramento people. I think the camps have a distinct flavor that's dictated to, I think, a large degree by their populations. And then, the proclivities of the administration also come into play. And I think the other thing that you see happening over time is that a lot of the restrictions get loosened over time. It's really strict for the first year, but after the first year, it's like, I think all the camps realize, these people are not a security threat, right? They largely stop manning the guard towers after the first year. They become more permissive in letting people leave the camp. They go through this loyalty questionnaire process where they segregate the so-called dangerous people all at one camp, Tule Lake. So I think security kind of really relaxes the other camps. And then, the people who leave camp early in 43 and 44 are disproportionately younger, educated Nisei. And so the camps become more Japanese and more children as time goes on. So I think culturally you see more kind of Japanese stuff in the camps in the last 2 years, because that reflects who's left in the camps.
I was like specifically curious about that. So you're actually ahead of kind of some of the what I was hoping to ask you, because I noticed like in Amachi there are tournaments in like 1944, 45. Okay. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, most San Diegan, the San Diego Japanese American community, most went to Poston. So one thing I think I do want to ask about the loyalty questionnaire, but even before we get to the loyalty questionnaire that came a little later, was there like classification and things like that is complicated when you're talking about like individual people. You're talking about whole families. There might be a family where most of them are in Los Angeles, but a sister might live in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Was there kind of a mechanism to like for families to unify, or was it all by the seat of their pants?
There was actually. First of all, there was a lot between December and the spring of 42 when the roundup started. There was a lot of movement. So you saw I've seen estimates that as much as 10%, 20% of the population moved in that time, specifically
to avoid that,
to be together. So you have the kids, maybe the parents run a farm in a rural area and the kids live in the city. So maybe before the roundup, the kids move back home so that they can make sure they get removed together. You see this whole, if you study the Nisei, you see so many Nisei who get married in February, March of 1942. Right, specifically because they want to guarantee that they go off, that they're able to be together when they get to wherever they're sent off. So there's a lot of that happens. And then later on, there are provisions where there's a bureaucratic process and a lot of red tape to go through, but the WRA does allow movement between camps for families to be reunited, and husbands to join wives, that sort of thing. So there was some provision for that later on as well, but a lot of that happened actually before the roundup. Okay,
interesting. Okay. Was there, so then let's talk a little bit about those loyalty questionnaires. So these, I've heard about the loyalty questionnaires, but our audience probably doesn't know about them. What was behind, the questions being asked? Right. I've heard 2 questions were the sticking point, but was that like almost an administrative afterthought that people like, oh, that will be no big deal, but it blew up? Or
that's kind of what happened. Okay. So basically, what happens is, as I mentioned, the WRA running the camps, had this basic philosophy that, we think, the vast majority of people in these camps are loyal, and they'd be better off not in a camp and being able to restart their lives outside of the restricted area. But in order to carry that out, we have to separate. We have to weed out, the disloyal from that population. And then in the fall of 42, there were also a couple of really well publicized kinds of unrest called a riot at Manzanar, a mass strike at Poston. So there was also this unrest and this feeling that there were these troublemakers, quote unquote, behind this. So the WRA wanted to kind of separate people out. At the same time, in early 1943, the army, which had up to that time not taken Japanese Americans who wanted to volunteer for the army. There were a few thousand Nisei who were already in the army from before the war. That they're a different group, but those who tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor were largely turned away. But then in early 1943, both for personnel reasons and for kind of publicity, PR reasons, the army kind of changes its mind and says, you know what, we should allow Nisei to enlist in the army. It would be good publicity. Japan is portraying this as a race war, saying, you look how Americans are treating Japanese. This would be a retort to them to say, no, look, Japanese Americans are fighting for the US. So they specifically create a segregated unit of just Nisei, the better for their exploits to be highlighted. But again, in order to get the personnel for this military unit, they needed to kind of segregate or separate. And so they come up with this, they jointly come up with this questionnaire that's administered in all of the camps in February of 1943, colloquially known as the loyalty questionnaire. And it had a series of questions, most of them fairly innocuous, but the key questions famously were questions 27 and 28. One basically asking if you would be willing to serve in the military wherever ordered, and the other asking if you would renounce any loyalty to the Emperor of Japan. The problem is they issued this questionnaire to everybody.
Men, women, or just men?
Everyone over the age of 17.
Okay, all right.
So they're asking, elderly women if they would be willing to serve in combat. They're asking, Nisei who had never been to Japan.
I mean, they're fierce.
If they would forswear loyalty to the emperor, and many of the Nisei said, I never had any loyalty to the emperor. This is a trick question. And then didn't take into consideration family dynamics. What happens if the parents answer one way and the kids answer another way? So there were all these complications that I think they didn't foresee. They did reword the questionnaire a little bit. So for Issei, would you, instead of would you serve in combat, would you agree to obey the laws of the U.S., blah blah blah. So they did make some adjustments there. But yeah, the like so much else of the incarceration, it's done very hurriedly, without kind of adequate thought, and so it just turned into this kind of disaster where many people, it didn't serve the function which it meant to do. It didn't end up separating. I mean, they did segregate, but the demographics of who was segregated weren't that different than the demographics of who wasn't. Just because they prioritized keeping families together. So if the father answers no to those questions, but the kids answer yes, they kind of keep the family together and send them all together to Tule Lake becomes the so-called segregation center where those deemed disloyal on the basis of the questionnaire were sent. And that becomes kind of this, this real prison camp atmosphere. And that takes place in the fall of 43 based on the answers to the questions in the spring of 43. So that takes place.
I'm curious, with things like that, everybody loves the fun of working with and navigating a bureaucracy. But, I'm just curious how much you talked about, like there were differences in people coming from one kind of part of California or the West Coast to a particular camp. So there was kind of a geographical dynamic, but then I'm also imagining there were kind of administrative dynamics. Like I can picture bureaucrats who just kind of said, no, I don't see the problem. Just ask the questions as they are. And I could see other bureaucrats kind of going, this could be problematic, maybe. And so what was the kind of interplay of those things? And like, were there some camps where, half or more of the population said, no, absolutely not. And other populations that were kind of persuaded one way or the other.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there were dramatic differences between the camps, but Tule Lake, something like a third of the population refused to answer the questionnaire at all. They just refused to fill it out.
I didn't know it was that many. Wow.
That didn't happen anywhere else. Manzanar, I forget the exact numbers, but like 20% of the Manzanar population ends up going to Tule Lake. But then at other camps, Minidoka and Amachi, the numbers are really small. So some of that I think is due to, again, the inherent features of who those people were in those camps. But look, having studied it a little more, I think a fair amount had to do with how it was administered at different camps. Some camps just did a better job of, sort of priming the population of what to expect and actually managing it. And then others, used, coercion as well and threats to get the answers they wanted. So it's not all a benign thing, but my sense is that it was a combination, of course, of both the inherent characteristics of the populations and the way it was administered. But for this particular, for the results of the questionnaire, I think a lot had to do with the way that it was administered by the different administrations of the different camps.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, awkward pause on my end there. My wife just came home and there was clattering of keys and whatnot, so I apologize. I'm surprised there haven't been more cats trying to climb me during this whole thing, so I'm just impressed at their restraint. Yeah, Yeah, that's really interesting. I was really curious about that because I'm a nerd. So what do you think was the overall impact of those like kind of sorting, segregation into different camps on on traditional martial arts? Do you think, like, was there like an initial almost revival of them in the camps where people might have been kind of reluctant initially, or was it just people were cautious about them? What's your impression?
I don't know a lot about this, so but one thing I would say is that Tule Lake, the camp that became the segregation center, the high security prison camp, because the assumption was that population was going to go to Japan. There, the WRA allowed Japanese culture, encouraged. Japanese language was taught.
Okay.
So in a sense, the WRA was washing their hands of these people, saying, okay, these guys, this group is going to Japan. So at Tule Lake, you were allowed to practice a lot of these things that were maybe discouraged at other camps. But like I said, even at the other camps, enforcement of in general becomes more lax as the war goes on. So I think even at the other camps, they become a little more Japanesey, is my sense. That camp leadership becomes increasingly issei, and the WRA, those who are running the camps become a little more lenient, realizing that the people who are here, they're harmless. There's we don't need barbed wire and armed guards with this population. So I think it becomes a little less strict. So I think my sense is that you do see more in places where the community wanted to practice more martial arts. I think that was allowed more later on.
Okay. I mean, we talked quite a bit about the yeah.
Is that your sense too, is in terms of what you've seen?
Yeah, it seems like it, but I didn't kind of know why. Like I got that impression, like there was kind of a, just looking at sumo, right? And I've been thinking of like the sumo thing, as much as it's my thing, I'm really passionate about. It's just like a core sample, like a cultural core sample through, just through kind of community life and the experience. And so I'm glad we're talking to you, because I noticed at Santa Anita, there was a tournament in 1942 in Gila River, a few other places. And then there's almost like a break in 1943.
Right, yeah.
Which it almost does sound like it's because of all that disruption, people moving around, the questionnaires, people getting reclassified and segregated into different camps. And then the intensification of recruitment, probably for the 442nd and MIS. Which, sorry, this is where Jake would be useful to, like, what's MIS? But the military intelligence service, right? Nisei linguists who are being recruited to work, translating Japanese documents, doing even tactical, like, frontline interpretation, trying to get Japanese soldiers to surrender, things like that. So there was a lot of recruitment for that. All that changed. And then there's a 1944, 1945, there are tournaments, including inter-camp sumo tournaments, where people are going from one camp to another camp. And they're being allowed to travel in between to do sumo tournaments. So I didn't know why, but as you kind of break that down, and especially kind of explain who's left in the camps and the loosening, that explains that a lot. That explains a lot. So I appreciate that.
One thing that I do want to add, I just kind of verified a little bit on the backside. There was a lot less things like kendo or any striking or anything along those lines. It seems that judo and sumo was like more prevalent, especially at that time. it was more popular than judo at that
Mhm.
time. But I think that those were a little bit more welcoming into the administrators. Like they thought that was more crowd pleasing, maybe less violent. I'm not sure exactly, but that's just a theory that I have right now.
Yeah. Well, I think Kendo, there was a sense that there was I think a stronger nationalistic element on that. That I think it was, I think, military and WRA would have discouraged it more. And I think there's a practical consideration too. I think of just equipment and gear that you need for Kendo. That where sumo, you can and people did make their own gear for sumo.
It is a very low threshold for entry. That's what a lot of us really like about it. You got a belt, you have a circle. There you go.
Yeah. And then I don't know if you've seen, but there are photos I know from the assembly center of, and I think we actually had the Kesho Mawashi, but it was they didn't have the materials to make one, of course, but so they just kind of painted, the aspects of the Kesho Mawashi onto just plain burlap with tempera paint. So they made do with whatever they had. And at the museum we actually had that homemade, assembly center Kesho Mawashi that we displayed. I don't know what happened to that, because that's that's a nightmare from a conservation standpoint to preserve something.
I'm sure.
Like that. But
I'm sure. And I didn't see it on their current collections list, but
it could have been borrowed also, and we could have.
That's possible.
It's possible.
Our local Japanese American Historical Society here in San Diego, they had 3 physical artifacts that were all made in camp at Poston. And one is a children's Kesho Mawashi. That it looks like it's almost like it's made out of furniture upholstery almost, and then there's like a string around it, and it's clearly a child's Kesho Mawashi. And then there's a hyoshigi, just made out of 2 pieces of wood, the clappers, and then a gumbai. And I saw this gumbai, that's the referee's fan. Usually has like a sun and moon or some kanji written on it. And I was looking at it, and it's a dowel, but then I was like, it's got like striping on it. And I was like, oh, it's cardboard. And it was cardboard just kind of like wedged into the wood and then kind of tied on with string. And on the one hand, it's very handicrafty, but if you didn't take it, but you wanted to do it, you had to make it, and so it's really neat. One of the families here in town preserved and donated it to our historical society.
Oh, great.
I have more questions, but that's actually a natural segue to kind of something of kind of the work that organizations like Densho do, archival organizations. If families have things that might be of kind of historical value or things like that, what can they do to have it preserved, have it documented, to kind of share it while still, like they're their family possessions, right? What can they do?
Well, it depends. I think for things like photographs, or documents, letters, diaries, a place like Densho can digitize and return the originals, or if the family wants the originals to go to an archive, we can work with an archive to do that, right? We work with various, academic libraries and museums and so forth. And then, we're not the only game in town, obviously. There's, there are many other institutions that do that. For 3-dimensional objects, your options are much more limited. I mean, the big player in our community is the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. There are other smaller museums locally that also collect things. And then, there are also mainstream museums. There's a Japanese American historian at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. So the Smithsonian has some things too. So, but it takes some effort to try to make some calls and inquire, as to where, what institutions might be interested in the 3-dimensional objects. And, in some cases, especially if they're large objects, it may be hard to find a home for them. two-dimensional things are a lot easier because they're
Right.
they take up less space and they can be digitized.
Right.
So
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm glad we're doing that.
and then the other thing is there are things families can do themselves. I mean, today it's just easy to scan materials yourself,
Mhm.
and we actually have a webinar series on keeping family histories, and there are some fairly simple things you can do in terms of just buying acid-free boxes and folders, and interleaving them with acid-free papers and so forth, that you can do for fairly little cost. That'll just keep your items safe, for safeguard them for longer than if you just leave them in regular folders with staples in them and so on, that they're just going to degrade over time.
Yeah.
There's some fairly simple things you can do to retard that sort of degradation.
That like craft supply or art supply.
A lot of the people who do, or in the scrapbooking subculture, have a lot of the same kinds of things. So
Nice. My wife's really into that, so I think I think I'll have her.
The acid-free papers and the special glues and so forth that are archival, that won't damage the items.
One other kind of topic I wanted to ask you about, especially since a lot of the leaders of sumo clubs that we were looking at were issei, who were kind of sumo club leaders, referees, things like that. They kind of went to different camps. Can you talk about, other than the WRA, you mentioned INS, DOJ.
Yes.
Can you tell a little bit about those?
Sure. Yeah. So that initial group we talked about, those issei that were rounded up, right after December 7 and into February of 42. I'd say as I said, they received hearings, and I'd say more or less half of them were kind of released, meaning they went to other camps, but they could at least rejoin their families. But the other half were kept in these separate camps, for the duration of the war. And these were camps run by the Justice Department and or the Army. And the biggest ones that held the West Coast Japanese Americans were Fort Missoula, Montana, Fort Lincoln, North Dakota, and in Bismarck, North Dakota, and Santa Fe, New Mexico. So many of these issei community leaders ended up in one of those camps. And then there were many intermediate camps that they went to. Lordsburg, New Mexico, which was run by the Army, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. There were a bunch of them. But the ones I just named were sort of the larger ones. And, issei, like my grandfather, kind of spent the rest of the war in those camps. There was also a camp in Texas called Crystal City.
I've seen sumo pictures from there.
So that was the Justice Department family camp. So that was where families who had decided they were going to return to Japan were sent to. And families were allowed to reunite. All the other camps I mentioned were just basically men. So, so Santa Fe, Fort Lincoln, all of those were just immigrant men, and there were also in most of those camps also German immigrants as well as other European immigrants who were seen as suspect for one reason or another. There was some interaction between the groups in some of those camps. So there's a whole separate series of camps for those. The enemy alien detention program run by the Justice Department.
One of our local historical society members, and also in one of the oral histories documented in Densho, one of the videos I saw, somebody was talking about Peruvians doing sumo I think in the Crystal City camp. So that was really interesting. I was like, oh, a what?
Where was Crystal City again?
Texas.
There's interest. They just put up a museum at Crystal, or museum exhibit in that area. So I think every camp now there's there's some organization building a memorial, or doing archaeological work, or preserving the site, or there's activity at all just about every one of these sites today, which is an interesting phenomenon, like 80 years on.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about the Tuna Canyon at the moment, just because of the fires in LA.
That's right.
Yeah, because Tuna Canyon's right up in kind of Pacific Palisades area, right? Yeah, and that was an INS camp?
Was that INS or Army? It was kind of a short-term facility where they kept, Issei arrested in the Los Angeles area for a short period of time before they were sent to one of these other ones I mentioned, to Santa Fe, to Fort Lincoln, to Missoula. So operated just for a short time, right after the arrests. Okay.
Interesting. So one of the people I was kind of curious about, because you talked about, I don't know how it connects, but one of the people that we're kind of interested in is somebody named Shoji Joe Hiraga. He, as a teenager in the early, 1934, he went to Japan to become a professional sumo wrestler. And there were about half a dozen people who did. And he went, he had some health problems. He had his appendix removed and surgery, and he didn't kind of thrive in sumo. He didn't climb up the rankings. And so he came back to the US in about, I think, 1937, shortly before his dad died. But he's a Nisei Kibe, came back to the US. But he was arrested, even though he's a US citizen, on December 7th. And I don't know what happens in kind of the months in between, but there's a FBI cable I found going back between the LA field office and Washington, D.C., saying, we've confirmed he's a US citizen, but we're keeping him in camp. We're keeping him detained.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I can't find anything else. He kind of died without any family, not old, but not middle-aged, about 60-ish. So, I can't kind of find or anything why. What? Just guessing. What probably happened to him between then? He of course shows up in I think Gila River, and then he goes to Jubilee Lake, which we can talk a little bit about why that probably was. But why would a Nisei continue to be detained?
That's rare. Because in Hawaii there were a fair number of Nisei who were arrested, but the rules were different in Hawaii because Hawaii was under martial law, and the civilian courts were not operational. Whereas on the continent, Nisei generally were not arrested in that initial roundup, or not held for very long, because the government knew that they couldn't hold them without charges, right? They could file habeas corpus petitions. Whereas Issei, they were enemy aliens, they didn't have those rights. So very few Nisei were detained in the way you described. So I'm not actually sure what happened with them.
Yeah. Okay. And I can't quite find, usually the records I've been able to find, the final accountability roster or something, right? Will show kind of the in and out date. But his in date is kind of fuzzy. He goes to Tule Lake from Gila River, but it I don't know what assembly center he went to or when he went to Gila River. Right. So maybe I'm not reading it carefully enough, but that I was just surprised at a Nisei where they said, he's a citizen, but we're keeping him.
No, that's definitely an unusual case. So be interesting. Were you able to get his case file from the National Archives?
Not yet, and that's something that I would love to get help from anybody, and it doesn't have to be you. If you send, direct me to somebody who could walk me through it. I've been trying to kind of see if there's a way to do it. It's a little Byzantine.
It is. And then they sometimes limit it to family. You have to show you're a family member.
Oh, okay.
Or I believe if you can prove that they're deceased also. I haven't done this much myself, so when we get off, I can direct you
Okay.
to a webinar that we did that does
Okay.
go through that process.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
So one thing I do know is then he went from Gila River to Tule Lake. So that presumably in like late 1943. So then presumably he answered no and to the loyalty questionnaire.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So because of the way it got segregated. Okay.
Right.
And then there's one other thing kind of about his history that I find kind of interesting. Well, two things. Before it gets to that point, is that he had really close relationships in LA. Like he was running the Los Angeles Sumo Club when he came back to the US, coaching, working closely with a lot of other Nisei young men, coaching and everything. But then, a lot of those young men he was competing and coaching and organizing the club with, they join MIS. They make very different kind of decisions.
Right. Yes.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the MIS, just because of language requirement, we're disproportionately Kibe. And some of their life stories are fascinating because they had these really wrenching decisions to make because they often have stronger connections in Japan. Maybe they have family in Japan. So yeah, they're I think there was a lot of ambiguity with a lot of the MIS guys. We don't. I think for decades, Japanese Americans have, liked to portray, the Nisei as being 100% American and super patriotic, and it's very gray in some cases, especially for those who have strong connections in Japan. There's been some excellent scholarship in recent years that has kind of looked at that part of the story. So that was very interesting because another thing I kind of noticed is in addition to several sumo wrestlers I've seen, including a couple that weren't Kibe, but they were involved in the sumo community. Right.
So I mean, probably they're doing practice in Japanese. So they probably had a stronger linguistic base.
Right.
They ended up in MIS. Right. And then the other thing that was interesting is that several of the sons of Issei sumo leaders, and like they're in Santa Fe, but their son is in MIS.
Yes.
And including one that chose to repatriate because his son was in Japan during the occupation after the war. So the really fascinating story.
No, it's really fascinating. There have been some recent translations of Issei memoirs or camp memoirs, and they're fascinating in the sense that the Issei, you hear that you read about Issei who are on the one hand pro-Japan and they're celebrating Japanese victories, but they have sons who are in the 442nd or in the MIS, and they're proud of their sons. That in a lot of ways, to be a good Japanese is to enlist and to be to serve in the war. But no matter where you live, and not see that as a contradiction.
Yeah, well, and I think this is just kind of guessing because I'm just interested in Japanese history. Is most Issei came to America not long after feudalism ended, right? Like it was during the Meiji period. It's they're coming to the US in a time when the sense of like a completely unified Japanese identity is still being formed, right? And it was still these like feudal domains that many of their parents grew up in and they grew up in. And so, I wonder how much, you serve your lord wherever you live, and that's America, you serve him, and that's, I don't know. I mean, just guessing about that.
Well, then the other thing that happens, and you see this in the WRA camps, is that once, Nisei, once word comes back of the Nisei in the 442nd and the heroism and the headlines and all of that stuff, that changes a lot of Issei's minds. They see the benefit that has for the community. So, you see Issei who are very much against their kids serving in the American, army, you know, and by 1945, they're like leading community memorial services in the camps as leaders of community government in those camps. So I think they see the benefit of the heroism of the Nisei soldiers as well. I think that the attitudes change over time.
So one other thing with Joe Hiraga that I find kind of interesting is he also left Tule Lake in like mid-March of 1946. Like what? Who was still in camp? What, 6 months after the war ended? Right.
Yeah. Tule Lake closed in March of 46, so he's probably one of the last.
So he was one of the last to leave, right? Okay. Like, why would he still, like, people like him be like, we don't know. Like, unfortunately, he doesn't leave a whole lot behind. What kind of choices were people making, or administration making, where people were still there?
Yeah, well, I think there was the exclusion orders to the West Coast were lifted at the beginning of 1945, right?
Okay. So before the war ended.
Yeah, before the war ended, but the Western Defense Command, the Army, still could have individual exclusion orders. They could still designate certain people that they weren't going to allow to leave, and I suspect a high percentage of the people in Tule Lake fell into that category. So he was probably prevented. He probably could not leave before that time. And even paradoxically, even though the war was already over, still seen as a threat in some ways, and just caught in this bureaucration. So I mean, I don't know the details of
and I don't know either. Yeah,
his case.
I was just
Tule Lake, didn't close till 46. It took them that long to clear everyone, and it was difficult for people to leave because their options for where to go were very limited also. So there was a strange phenomenon at the end of the war where people didn't want to leave. Japanese Americans who remained in the camp didn't want to leave because they feared what was on the outside. And while they were imprisoned, they were at least given 3 meals a day, and their basic needs were covered. And they had formed a bit of kind of a society within the camp, and many were terrified to leave. So the WRA literally had to evict people, to kick them out of camp at the end.
Okay. Wow. This actually goes way back, because something that you said reminded me about the lifting of the orders on the West Coast, and that kind of reminded me of timelines. This is how my odd connection process worked. But it's interesting, as much as I've been interested in World War II history, the removal experience, one thing that I hadn't kind of like registered in my head, and it may just be a nothing burger and it wasn't a consideration, but I hadn't really thought about kind of the timeline, like the global timeline, very long way to ask this question, of the turning points in World War II and the turning points in decision making in the incarceration process. So like the Battle of Midway happens in early June of 1942, where half the Japanese Navy is pretty much sunk.
Right.
At least all the carriers. The ability to project power beyond the Western Pacific is gone. And we now know that was a turning point in the war, and Japan was not going to be able to pose a threat to the West Coast.
Right.
Did people know that at the time? Did that go into any of the calculus? Because, my lay mind, as just an amateur historian, just kind of go, like, everybody's in assembly centers at that point. Japan doesn't pose a threat. Let them go home.
Right.
I mean, am I crazy?
Well, I mean, if it were a purely logical decision, maybe that's, but it wasn't. I mean, it was a political decision, and the same people who had agitated for mass removal would have been up in arms. you know.
Right.
One of the things I'm fascinated by is that you would think that in these West Coast states that anti-Japanese sentiment would decline once all the Japanese Americans were gone and safely put in concentration camps, but it didn't. It increased, and all these societies in the Western states, or the West Coast states, started movements to try to strip Nisei of their citizenship, to
like the Sons of the Golden West and stuff like that.
And, to prevent the return of Japanese Americans. So, and as I mentioned, the alien land law enforcement ramped up. California appropriated additional funding to prosecute alien land law cases. So, the anti-Japanese sentiment actually rose, during the war, which I find, doesn't make sense. But, again, it's not a logical thing.
Yeah.
It's a political and I'd say kind of emotional thing. And then just stunningly is how quickly sentiment shifts in the other direction when the war ends. And Japan's now an ally, and how quickly anti-Japanese sentiment fades after the war. That the Earl Warrens of the world become sympathetic to Japanese Americans all of a sudden.
And I think John Dower did some really interesting work in two of his books, like Embracing Defeat, and then I forget the other one. They're both really, really good and interesting books about that very sudden
All right,
shift.
what was that again, Brian? What was it?
I think it was called War Without Mercy. Might be the
War Without Mercy and Embracing Defeat. I read Embracing Defeat first a few years ago during a trip to Japan, which was just really an interesting way to read it. But War Without Mercy, and just for kind of the audience, War Without Mercy talks about how this just complete racial hatred that animated the war on both sides, and this like mutually reinforcing kind of sense of Japanese propaganda Japanese people were telling themselves in Imperial Japan, how Americans were reading that propaganda, seeing that propaganda and taking it at face value, and like vice versa. And the like dehumanization, but then also the strange phenomenon when the war ends of the two societies almost using the same logic to suddenly be like, we're okay with each other.
Yes.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. I totally recommend that. I think the one thing that, because this is a segue before we kind of wrap up, because it does go into kind of the current application of this and why this conversation is kind of timely and meaningful, is there's still like a few ways that people kind of rationalize or explain the removal and incarceration. Like you kind of hinted at that. What's your kind of I think the one I found kind of the most insidious was this one that said called it like preserving a people. It was to preserve the Nikkei community and protect them during World War II. And especially looking at Sumo died. Like, it's a cultural thing that was important to people, and it died after the war on the mainland.
Right.
And I don't know, like, isn't a culture part of a people? How much are you preserving if you're killing a part of the culture? So that's my reaction. But like, what do you think about those kinds of arguments?
At the time, that was a rationale that we're doing this to protect Japanese Americans, which on its face value makes no sense, right? You don't
which direction are the guns pointing?
Yeah, you don't imprison the group that you're protecting. You imprison the group that's attacking them. It's an obvious rationale that just doesn't make any sense. Have you
heard any other of these things that still kind of like percolate
another,
not that we want to reinforce them, but that you have a kind of answer to?
Well, I think the other thing that's always alleged is to point out specific Japanese Americans who did X or Y, and therefore that's reason to lock everyone up. And again, I mean, out of there were 250,000 or whatever Japanese Americans, and were there some who were pro-Japan and might have been dangerous? Of course, but that's not a rationale for locking up everybody, right? And as I had mentioned before, the FBI, J. Edgar had believed that they had identified everybody who was a danger. I would argue they had over-identified, but nonetheless, that they felt like what they did, that initial roundup, if you say, was sufficient, and that there was no need for any further incarceration. So again, the idea that yes, there were some Japanese Americans who were dangerous is true, but in our system of law, you imprison the people that you have evidence against, and you leave everyone else alone. And I think there was a racial basis, obviously, for why, for Germans and Italians were treated as individuals, and Japanese were treated as a group.
And it does seem like, the FBI that you referred to thought of it as like, this is within our scope, like we can handle this, like, this is just counterintelligence.
And again, to me, the biggest counter argument is Hawaii, where again, Hawaii is where you would have thought there should have been a mass roundup. They didn't do that. They imprisoned like 1% of the population. And then my other image that always to me is telling is this, the scene of, and this really happened, of people of Japanese descent, often of mixed race Japanese descent, who were in orphanages, had no conception of being Japanese, were taken from the orphanages and put into a concentration camp with other Japanese Americans, where they would develop a racial consciousness that they never had before.
Right.
Just defies all logic. But
that is the most wild. That's so wild.
This type of policy.
Yeah. It is crazy. It doesn't make sense.
In hindsight, in hindsight, obviously to a lot of very smart people that did make sense, but
smart isn't necessarily always good. There's more things that are important in life than smart, right? Sure. Kindness goes a little ways. That's a good thing. Can you think of anything else that, like, as we were talking, really kind of jogged your memory that you think is worth kind of sharing, or that you find interesting or on topic?
I mean, we covered a lot, so nothing offhand. I'm sure there are, but I think we covered most things.
Okay.
As you know, I could go on and on. So.
As could I.
Really, I wouldn't. I can't imagine.
My long entreating emails about please help me didn't get that across. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. That I learned a lot. I wanted our audience to learn a lot, and I knew I would learn something, but I've actually learned a lot. It's actually helped me put a lot of things in kind of perspective, giving me some new angles that I want to look at. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
This is fun, and I'm fascinated that your group exists and that you're doing this, and I think it's a really great project. And I think for any kind of history, amateur or professional, kind of the gold is when we get to finding something where you go like, wait, one person has written an article about this. Anything else? Nothing? It's all mine, and so that opportunity to really kind of dig into something that other people have done some work on, but to really like pick up that ball on a fascinating topic and use that as an opportunity to tell kind of bigger stories is really a cool opportunity. And I think very timely.
both with kind of the growth of international sumo, but also just what's happening in our world and the country. A lot of similar themes. So,
yeah. If anyone is interested in details of the story, come to Densho. We have a online encyclopedia that has a ton of information. We've got 1,000 oral histories, and they're not just oral histories, right? They're indexed, they're transcribed, so you can search for specific subject issues and find someone who talks about that specific thing. And I'm sure you probably have searched for sumo and people who have talked about it. So it's a nice resource. But there's, in the last 5 years, there's just been so much material that has come online. There's an enormous cache of material that UC Berkeley has digitized from their archive. There's stuff from the National Archives, various universities. There's just a ton of material now available online. So if you're at all interested in this topic, you could learn a lot without leaving your front door. And then if you do want to go out, UCLA, and I found that almost every major university in the country has something related to this because it was such a wide-ranging program. So one of my hobbies, even when I'm on vacation, is going to the local research library, and inevitably I'll find something.
Yeah.
So I'm a nerd too, definitely.
Yeah. I wish my wife would let me, work on vacations, but she forbids it. So, yes, we're required to relax apparently.
Happy wife, happy life.
Yes. I know.
That is real.
Yes.
All right. I think this is a great spot. Thank you again. Thank you, Nate, for running this one. This was really fun. Bye.
Great. Thank you.
Hot